Between 1957 and 1975, tens of thousands of civilians were executed in South Vietnam. They did not die on the front line. They were eliminated in their own villages under a calculated plan to erase all opposition. The Vietcong turned fear into their main weapon. Every nightly capture, every disappearance, and every exposed corpse had a purpose: to break the will of the communities until they were subdued. Terror transformed into a form of invisible governance which decided the fate of millions without the need for open battles. How was this system of domination organized? What mechanisms made it possible for so many years? And why does its memory remain silenced in the official history of Vietnam? Vietnam had experienced foreign occupations over more than 1 millennium. Chinese influence left a deep imprint on administration, writing, and numerous cultural practices. Each period of independence was constantly threatened by pressure from neighboring empires to the north. As the 19th century progressed, the country entered a new stage of domination, marked by French colonial expansion. France consolidated its control after the landing in Da Nang in the year 1858. In a few decades, Vietnam was incorporated as part of French Indochina, along with Cambodia and Laos. The colonial system reorganized the agricultural economy to the benefit of the metropolis. Rice, rubber, and coffee plantations were established under intensive exploitation schemes, while the peasantry was subordinated to local elites associated with the French administration. In rural villages, the tax burden became suffocating. Households were forced to give up substantial portions of their crops, while forced labor on roads, railways, and canals completed the picture of exploitation. Colonial education, limited to a collaborationist minority, became a tool of exclusion. The majority of the population remained illiterate, with no options for social mobility and little chance to participate in political life. At the beginning of the 20th century, this discontent generated expressions of resistance. Nationalist movements emerged, inspired both by local traditions of rejection of domination and by modern ideas spread from France and China. The failure of gradual reforms intensified colonial repression and favored the radicalization of a new generation. In this environment, Ho Chi Minh was formed, who would later be the central figure of the Viet Minh and subsequently the Vietcong. Born in 1890 in a family of minor mandarins, he traveled to different countries, held modest jobs, and joined political circles in Paris. There he became closely acquainted with the Communist Party and the anti-colonial rhetoric of the labor movements. He later attended the Communist University of the Toilers of the East in Moscow and participated in the organization of revolutionary cadres in China. This itinerary forged a synthesis between Vietnamese nationalism and Leninist-inspired communist discipline. The Second World War altered the landscape. In the year 1940, after the defeat of France to Germany, Japan occupied Indochina and formally maintained the colonial administration under the Vichy regime. This coexistence increased the exploitation of resources in favor of the Japanese war effort. In 1945, the imposed requisitions caused a devastating famine in northern Vietnam, with the death of more than 1 million people. The inability of the colonial authorities to respond generated a vacuum of legitimacy. That same year, Ho Chi Minh promoted the creation of the Viet Minh, League for the Independence of Vietnam. The movement combined nationalist discourse and communist organization. During the Japanese occupation, it developed guerrilla networks in rural areas and attracted support by presenting itself as the only genuinely Vietnamese force against the French and Japanese. With the capitulation of Japan in August of 1945, Ho proclaimed independence in Hanoi on the 2nd of September, citing fragments of the American Declaration of Independence. France did not accept losing Indochina. Consequently, the First Indochina War was triggered, fought between 1946 and 1954. During those years, the Viet Minh faced the colonial army through ambushes, infrastructure sabotage, and peasant mobilization. The villages were transformed into nodes of intelligence, transportation, and supply. After the communist victory in China in 1949, the Viet Minh received logistical support and training from the border. Although at a disadvantage in heavy weaponry, it compensated for that weakness with discipline, knowledge of the terrain, and the capacity for prolonged attrition. The decisive battle occurred at Dien Bien Phu in the year 1954. France sought to force a direct confrontation in a fortified valley. General Vo Nguyen Giap responded with a prolonged siege. For 56 days, tens of thousands of fighters moved heavy artillery through mountains and jungles surrounding the French garrison. The trenches advanced until the perimeter was closed, while air supplies became increasingly limited. On the 7th of May, more than 13,000 French soldiers surrendered. The defeat forced France to negotiate. The Geneva Accords, signed in 1954, established the temporary division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The north was under the control of Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party, with its capital in Hanoi, while the south was assigned to a regime supported by the United States. It was agreed to hold reunification elections in 1956, but the South Vietnamese president Ngo Dinh Diem, fearing a communist victory, cancelled the process. In the north, the Workers' Party of Vietnam consolidated a one-party state based on agrarian collectivization, ideological control, and administrative centralization. In the south, the Diem government implemented policies that alienated Buddhist peasants and political opponents. Its strategic Hamlets program, designed to isolate the Viet Minh, became a mechanism of repression and forced displacement. The contrast between the official discourse and daily experience undermined the regime's legitimacy. In 1960, the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, known as the Vietcong, was founded. Although it presented itself as an autonomous organization, it was closely directed from Hanoi. The North Vietnamese Communist Party dictated the political guidelines, provided weaponry and training, and coordinated the general strategy. Its structure combined clandestine political cells, guerrilla units, and popular committees in villages, which acted as parallel administrations. The Viet Cong adopted the Maoist doctrine of prolonged people's war, conceived in 3 stages: clandestine political construction, guerrilla warfare against the state apparatus, and conventional warfare in the final phase. The basis of the scheme was the control of the peasantry as a source of recruitment, intelligence, and logistics. To maintain this control, the North organized the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of roads through Laos and Cambodia. Despite constant bombings, the trail remained operational thanks to thousands of peasants mobilized as porters and engineers. This corridor guaranteed a constant flow of fighters, weapons, and supplies to the south, becoming a central element of the strategy. The Viet Cong presented itself as a national liberation movement, opposing Saigon's corruption and defending the peasants. Its internal operation, however, followed the model of a clandestine communist party, with vertical discipline, internal surveillance, and elimination of dissidents. In the villages under its influence, popular tribunals, land redistribution, and control networks were established. State authority was replaced by a parallel power that combined propaganda, discipline, and coercion. The concept of prolonged war was adapted to the Vietnamese context. The jungle and the delta offered an ideal setting for an insurgency that blended with the civilian population. In the initial phases, the Viet Cong did not need to conquer cities. It was enough to weaken government authority in rural areas. As that authority eroded, the clandestine apparatus expanded. With the beginning of the decade of 1960, the insurgency had evolved into a complex system integrating military forces, intelligence, and political administration. Its national liberation discourse remained the propagandistic foundation, but in practice, a project of comprehensive control over community life was being consolidated. Every village was transformed into a revolutionary cell with its own mechanisms of discipline, indoctrination, and punishment. The Viet Cong had traveled a path that led it from anti-colonial resistance to becoming an instrument of an expanding communist state. What initially appeared as nationalist insurgency was already shaping up as an apparatus of domination, ready to employ systematic methods to neutralize local resistances and ensure social control in the areas under its influence. In the year 1957, the Viet Cong initiated a key strategy to consolidate its political control in the villages of South Vietnam. It was called the Campaign to Destroy the Enemy's Administrative Apparatus. Its logic was straightforward. The presence of the South Vietnamese state in the rural communities was manifested through teachers, village chiefs, officials, police, and religious leaders. If these figures were eliminated, Saigon's influence would disappear and the front could fill the void. Violence was not considered a collateral effect of the conflict, but a planned method of social reconfiguration. The doctrinal origin of this policy was found in the Maoist People's War Manuals and the guidelines of the Workers' Party of Vietnam, which supervised the insurgency from Hanoi. The documents insisted on the need to neutralize the internal enemy, defined not as an armed combatant, but as any individual capable of exercising authority or transmitting values different from those of the revolution. The concept of enemy was expanded to include everything from state figures to community leaders with moral or cultural influence. In each disputed village, the Vietcong's clandestine cells drew up blacklists. The security committees gathered information through informants, forced meetings, and constant observation of daily activities. The records included full name, age, position, religious affiliation, educational level, and family ties. A teacher could be singled out for teaching values considered bourgeois, a monk for spreading beliefs labeled as superstitions, a police officer for defending the Saigon regime. This process followed a bureaucratic system that determined who should be eliminated first and what effect their disappearance would have on the community. The execution was conceived as a political act. The operations took place at night. Armed squads entered selected homes, captured the victim, and took them to a predefined space, a clearing in the jungle, a central square, or even the courtyard of the victim's own house. The death could occur in a public or semi-public manner in front of family members, neighbors, or the entire village. The methods varied: close-range shootings, beheadings, improvised hangings, or burials alive. Sometimes the bodies were displayed after the execution, accompanied by signs identifying them as traitors or agents of imperialism. The ritual dimension pursued a specific objective: to induce lasting fear and link obedience with survival. In the Mekong Delta, corpses were dragged through the streets and hung on poles with visible messages. In some provinces, children were forced to witness the bodies and repeat political slogans. In this way, death was transformed into a public lesson about the consequences of defying the Vietcong. The elimination of local leaders had immediate repercussions. The village chief, a central figure in the mediation between community and state, disappeared, interrupting all coordination with Saigon. Teachers, who represented both literacy and governmental authority, were killed to discourage formal education. Doctors and nurses, accused of collaborating with programs supported by the United States, were executed, depriving entire villages of basic services. In a few weeks, entire communities were left without social or institutional references. In the province of Quang Nhai, a teacher was forced to dig his own grave in front of his students before being executed. In Binh Dinh, entire families of communal leaders were eliminated, including elders and minors, to prevent continuity of authority. In the Delta, Catholic priests were hanged in squares while altars were destroyed. Buddhist monks, marked as ideological obstacles, were beheaded in public ceremonies. These actions aimed to demonstrate that no moral or spiritual figure could compete with revolutionary discipline. Statistical records show the magnitude of the campaign. Between 1957 and 1972, conservative estimates placed the number of civilians executed for political reasons between 36,000 and 50,000. South Vietnamese and American military documents suggest that the actual figure could have exceeded 100,000 victims. In Binh Dinh province alone, between 1967 and 1970, more than 300 selective murders were documented. Near Saigon, in Go Vap, a mass grave was discovered with 9 teachers executed by shots to the nape of the neck. The impact of these actions was also corroborated by Vietcong defectors. One of them recounted having participated in several tens of public executions during the 1960s. Each death, according to his testimony, was accompanied by a doctrinal explanation read aloud where the alleged crimes of the victim were listed, and the slogan that the elimination constituted an educational act was repeated. These accounts confirm that violence was institutionalized as a part of collective indoctrination. The consequences in the villages were profound. The absence of teachers meant generations deprived of basic education. The removal of healthcare personnel drastically reduced rural medical care. The death of religious leaders broke traditional solidarity networks. The reorganization occurred under the authority of Vietcong popular committees, which imposed permanent surveillance, controlled food distribution, and convened mandatory indoctrination meetings. Fear became a central tool of control, more effective than any armed patrol. The real possibility of being executed for collaborating with Saigon created a climate of absolute silence. Entire families chose to hide their opinions, while the denunciation of a neighbor could become a survival strategy. Community trust was replaced by constant suspicion. The violence was not limited to visible figures. It also sought to dismantle social groups considered hostile, such as medium and large landowners. In some cases, their assets were confiscated and redistributed. In others, they and their families were executed. This policy weakened the southern economic structure and at the same time allowed the Vietcong to present themselves as redistributors to poor peasants. The pattern persisted for more than 1 decade, with regional variations and different intensities, but with a constant objective to dismantle any form of local power that did not depend on the party. The villages were transformed into units under revolutionary control, without traditional leaders, without independent teachers, and without religious references outside the communist apparatus. The violence was not accidental, but an essential part of the system. The social consequences extended in the long term. Entire communities were marked by the loss of their role models. The fragmentation of the social fabric became irreversible in many cases. Generations of children grew up without teachers or spiritual leaders, with their cultural education replaced by political slogans. Fear became integrated into everyday life as an invisible boundary that regulated what could be said or done. In this way, the Vietcong managed to consolidate control over large rural areas in the south. Planned terror became one of the pillars of their domination structure. Once established, any sign of resistance vanished in the face of the certainty that it could translate into immediate execution. The campaign of selective assassinations had fulfilled its purpose of eliminating rivals and ensuring the installation of parallel administrations under revolutionary control. In the depths of the jungles of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the Vietcong established a clandestine detention system that functioned as a network of mobile prisons. These facilities, constructed mainly with bamboo and camouflaged under vegetation, were designed not only to hold prisoners, but also to break them through a systematic combination of deprivations, torture, and psychological manipulation. The complexes frequently moved, sometimes every 2 weeks, to avoid being detected by aviation. The captives were forced to travel long distances in chains, guarded by armed guards, under extreme conditions of tropical heat, constant rain, or mountainous terrain. During these marches, those who collapsed were abandoned or forced to continue dragged by other prisoners. The result was the proliferation of foot wounds, leech infections, dehydration, and severe exhaustion, which prevented any organization of internal resistance. Once transferred, the detainees were confined to pits dug in the ground, cages suspended between trees, or open huts that exposed them to the elements. There was no clear separation between day and night. Direct sunlight, monsoon rains, constant humidity, and insects were a deliberate part of the prison environment. The lack of permanent structures prevented minimal conditions for hygiene or rest, while the humidity and muddy ground worsened the physical deterioration. Scarce food constituted an instrument of control. The diet consisted of spoiled rice, raw roots, boiled leaves, insects, or remnants of fermented fish. Whole days often went by without receiving food, while water was rationed in minimal amounts. The guards, in contrast, maintained stable rations, allowing the progressive degradation of the prisoners to be observed as a controlled variable. The consequences included dysentery, typhoid fever, beriberi, scurvy, severe infections, and untreated malaria. The deceased were buried without record, which made the deaths within the system invisible. Psychological isolation was a central tool. Prisoners were separated from each other, forced to remain silent, and deprived of any outside information. Human contact was limited to interrogations. The constant uncertainty about their fate produced insomnia, temporal disorientation, episodes of hallucinations, and in some cases catatonic states. The absence of predictable stimuli gradually generated a collapse of individual perception. Among the physical breaking techniques, the tiger cages stood out, bamboo structures of small dimensions that made it impossible to lie down or stand up. These cages were placed under the equatorial sun or under incessant rains, which caused muscle swelling, purulent ulcers, drastic weight loss, skin infections, and disorientation. Some prisoners remained for entire weeks in those conditions. The beatings were frequent and carried out with instruments designed to inflict pain without causing immediate death: flexible bamboo canes, hardened sticks, or the butts of assault rifles. The blows were directed at ribs, knees, spine, and soft organs. These sessions were alternated with brief breaks to prolong the suffering. Another common practice was the suspension of prisoners by wrists or ankles for periods of several hours. This method caused dislocations, vascular pressure, intense neurological pain, and temporary paralysis of the limbs. The captives could barely walk in the days following, but were forced to do so under the threat of new sessions. The simulation of suffocation consisted of pouring water through mouth and nose while the head was covered with damp cloth, provoking the sensation of imminent drowning. The procedure was repeated in rounds until it caused convulsions or loss of physiological control. Another technique employed was living coffins, wooden boxes so small that they forced the prisoner to remain in a fetal position. There they could spend from 1 day to 3 with no possibility of movement. The result was extreme claustrophobia, cramps, sensory deprivation, and psychological collapse. The jailers combined violence with phases of emotional manipulation. At certain times they offered additional food, allowed brief baths, or simulated gestures of cordiality. They took advantage of these truces to promise releases, contact with family members, or the sending of letters that never reached their destination. This alternation between mistreatment and apparent benevolence aimed to create emotional dependence and weakening of the will. Prisoners considered of military or propaganda interest were subjected to additional pressure to sign confessions drafted by their interrogators. They were forced to read statements in which they incriminated themselves for war crimes or political collaborations. Sometimes these readings were filmed or recorded and then broadcast on Radio Hanoi or shown to foreign delegations as proof of repentance. The Vietnamese captives from the south received the harshest treatment. They were classified as ideological traitors and deprived of any chance of redemption. Their interrogations were more violent, the conditions of confinement more degrading, and their deaths were not officially recorded. Testimonies indicate that some of their bodies were used in testing new torture techniques, such as prolonged exposure to scavenging insects or the application of toxic substances to open wounds. The most well-known case in Western sources was that of the American officer James Nicholas Rowe, captured in 1963 and held for 5 years. He was chained, confined in bamboo cages, and subjected to daily interrogations. The pressure for him to sign statements against his own country was constant without success. In 1968, he managed to escape after attacking a guard with a machete and reaching an area controlled by Allied forces. His subsequently published testimony provided one of the most detailed accounts of the Vietcong's clandestine system. Other prisoners were used in propaganda setups. Before receiving visits from international delegations, they were cleaned, fed, and coached for several days to simulate acceptable conditions. These staged acts were part of a counter-information strategy aimed at concealing the reality of the system. The prison apparatus operated like a parallel war, waged without rifles or cannons, but with hunger, isolation, manipulation, and calculated destruction of human resistance. The techniques were documented in internal manuals and shared with revolutionary organizations from other regions, extending their influence beyond Indochina. Decisions about the fate of the prisoners were made by political committees, which evaluated each case according to its usefulness. Some were kept as a source of information, others as propaganda material, and not a few were executed as exemplary punishment or used in experimental practices. Hue on fire, the city turned into a tomb. The Hue massacre, which occurred during the Tet Offensive, transformed one of the most emblematic cities of Vietnam into the scene of an ideological purge of great proportions. In less than 1 month, thousands of civilians were executed systematically in what constituted a social re-engineering operation planned in advance by the communist apparatus. It was not a combat excess nor an accidental result of urban warfare, but a meticulous process with clearly defined political and social purposes. On the 30th of January of 1968, Communist forces launched the Tet Offensive, which involved the coordinated attack on tens of South Vietnamese cities and towns during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The strategy sought to trigger a popular uprising and demonstrate that no area in the South was beyond insurgent reach, even those under direct United States protection. Hue, former imperial capital, university city and spiritual center, represented a target of great symbolic value whose conquest would have an impact both nationally and internationally. In the early morning of the 31st of January, units of the Vietcong and the regular army of North Vietnam broke into the city after a carefully planned assault. They captured the imperial citadel, administrative facilities and large urban areas. However, the military takeover was only the first phase. The real objective was to turn Hue into a model city under revolutionary control, demonstrating that communism could be imposed not only with military victories, but also through immediate political and social transformation. To achieve that goal, it was necessary to eliminate those who represented continuity from the previous order. Government officials, military officers, intellectuals, religious leaders, teachers, and business people were classified as structural threats. Their elimination was carried out from lists compiled over years by clandestine cells infiltrated in the neighborhoods. These records detailed names, addresses, positions, and affiliations, which allowed for precise identification of each target. The raids began once military control of the main sectors was consolidated. Armed squads moved house to house with documents in hand, read specific names, and detained the indicated individuals without allowing resistance. In neighborhoods where officials and professionals lived, the majority of adults disappeared in the first days. The methods of execution varied according to the symbolic position of the victims. Public figures were executed with shots to the nape of the neck, and their bodies appeared tied and with signs of planned death. Other detainees were taken to the outskirts and eliminated in mass graves dug in fields, cemeteries, or banks of the Perfume River. Some were buried alive after digging their own graves, a practice intended to intensify collective terror. In places like Phu Cam, Dam Chan, Bai Dao, and the Tu Dam Pagoda, improvised processing centers were established. There, groups of prisoners were executed at regular intervals. Former military, police, and local political leaders were subjected to torture before being killed. Bone fractures, mutilations, burns, and lethal blows were applied systematically in order to destroy any reference of authority that might challenge the communist imposition. The magnitude of the purge was revealed once South Vietnamese and American forces regained control of the city on February 24th. In the weeks following, mass graves were located in temples, schools, gardens, and riverbanks. In the Tu Dam Pagoda, more than 150 bodies were found. In areas near the Perfume River, hundreds of bodies tied in family groups were unearthed. The Gia Hoi School, used as a detention center, contained bodies buried directly in its courtyard. The discovery conditions showed logistical patterns. The corpses appeared aligned with similar wounds and uniform bindings, which evidenced standardized procedures. The decomposition, accelerated by the tropical climate, made facial recognition difficult, so the identifications were carried out through clothing, personal belongings, dental records, and body marks. For the communist apparatus, these deaths were justified as the elimination of class enemies. Documents captured after the withdrawal explained the massacre as necessary cleansing against feudal and bourgeois remnants. From that perspective, the executions were not presented as crimes, but as a step towards the implementation of a socialist model. However, the planned nature, the absence of legal processes, and the inclusion of women, children, and religious figures evidenced an operation contrary to any international norms of conflict. The impact on the city was immediate. Entire families disappeared. Religious and educational communities were decimated. The cultural and academic elite was practically destroyed. Fear and distrust came to define the daily life of the survivors. For years, the inhabitants of Hue avoided talking about the event, even in private circles, adopting behaviors of silence and withdrawal as a survival strategy. On the international level, Hue became a turning point. Although militarily the Tet Offensive did not achieve its objectives, the images of corpses and mass graves, disseminated by media, impacted public opinion. In the United States, the perception of the conflict changed drastically, weakening political and social support for the intervention. The evidence presented in international organizations reinforced the idea that Vietnamese communism applied methods of mass repression in its advance. After the reunification in 1975, the Vietnamese Communist Party denied the Hue Massacre or presented it as a propaganda construct of their adversaries. The archives were classified, academic investigations censored, and the families of the victims subjected to surveillance and silencing. No official monuments were erected, nor was the number of dead publicly acknowledged. The Hue massacre was neither an excess of war nor an accidental consequence of urban chaos. It was a premeditated operation designed to eliminate a generation of leaders and replace traditional structures with revolutionary institutions. For just under 1 month, the ancient imperial capital was transformed into a laboratory of ideological purge executed with bureaucratic discipline and methodical violence. For thousands of Vietnamese children, the war was not a distant reality, but an immediate experience that transformed them into instruments of a conflict without limits. The Vietcong used miners as fighters, spies, saboteurs, executioners, and at times as suicides in an institutionally planned process that completely ignored international child protection agreements. In the peasant communities of the South, nightly kidnappings became a constant threat. Specialized units carried out raids against previously selected homes. The children, mostly between 10 and 15 years old, were chosen after assessments of their physical strength, family loyalties, and the economic vulnerability of their homes. These operations were not improvised. They required detailed intelligence on the family structure, daily routines, and the absence of nearby South Vietnamese patrols. In several cases, the commands acted with lists developed thanks to informants infiltrated into communal life. The assault groups arrived silently, surrounded the houses, and extracted the miners with military precision. Parents who resisted were beaten or executed as a warning. Mothers were forced to hand over their children under the threat of burning down the village. Sometimes the kidnappers left symbols painted on the walls to instill fear and prevent retaliation. Many children woke up hours later, chained in the jungle without understanding the reason for their relocation. Declassified intelligence reports in 1969 revealed that in some provinces of the Mekong Delta, up to a significant fraction of the Vietcong fighters were under 16 years old. In sabotage and reconnaissance units, the proportion was even higher due to the tactical advantages of employing children. Short stature, ease of movement, social invisibility, and greater psychological malleability. Similar patterns were identified in mountainous regions like Thanh Nguyen, where they were used as guides, porters, and sentinels. Once captured, the children were taken to hidden camps in dense jungles or remote mountain ranges. There, a transformation process began, structured in phases. The first was isolation. They were forbidden to mention their names, talk about their families, or remember their past. Attempting to do so was punished with beatings, deprivation of food, or confinement in covered pits. Depersonalization constituted the basis of the training. The ideological indoctrination occupied several hours daily. Adapted texts of Marxist inspiration, lessons on Vietnamese revolutionary history, and sessions of memorizing slogans were used. Children were taught that their parents were traitors if they collaborated with the enemy, that their villages were centers of corruption, and that the National Liberation Front was their only legitimate family. The idea of dying for the revolution was presented as the most honorable destiny. The military training was simultaneous and demanding. The children ran barefoot, carrying replicas of rifles until they got used to their weight. They crawled under barbed wire, crossed mined areas during the night, and practiced silent killings with bamboo knives. They learned to manipulate improvised explosives, assemble mines, shoot accurately at short and medium range, and execute ambushes with coded signals. The miners were classified according to their age and build. The smallest were employed as messengers, crossing lines with memorized information. Others posed as beggars in villages controlled by the government to observe patrols and defenses. In combat, they were used as saboteurs. They placed explosives on bridges or depots, acted as snipers from trees, and remained motionless for hours, camouflaged in the vegetation. In extreme operations, some were used as suicides. In a documented action in Quang Nhai in 1969, an 11-year-old girl was sent to a military detachment with a fruit basket containing remote-controlled explosives. The detonation killed several soldiers and the girl. Later testimonies confirmed that she had been kidnapped weeks earlier and convinced that her sacrifice represented an act of salvation for her people. The indoctrination process reached its most radical point when children were forced to execute prisoners. Those who refused were punished with beatings, confinement, or the obligation to witness the death of other miners. Once they committed their first execution, they were trapped in an irreversible circle. They were murderers in the eyes of their communities, bearers of military secrets, and considered enemy combatants if they deserted. Internal estimates indicated that the majority did not survive beyond 2 years. A large proportion died in combat, while another part was executed for attempted escape or underperformance. Only a minority reached adulthood, in many cases with severe physical sequelae such as amputations, chronic infections, and untreated injuries. Subsequent reports recorded recurrent psychological consequences, including anxiety, violent episodes, severe insomnia, and dissociative behaviors. Recruitment was not limited to abductions. Thousands of orphans, a result of the fighting and bombings, were absorbed by the insurgency. For them, the offer of food, shelter, and belonging presented itself as the only alternative. Without schooling or stable contact with adults outside the military apparatus, they grew up within mobile structures that moved them from one front to another. The constant mobility prevented lasting bonds and fostered absolute dependence on the organization. In specific camps, manuals were developed for the use of miners. A document captured in 1970 explained that the young people represented a tactical resource due to their obedience, capacity for infiltration, and ease of indoctrination. It also indicated that the break with the family past should be reinforced to ensure total loyalty to the cause. The recruited children were rarely officially registered. Their deaths did not appear in reports, and their bodies, when recovered, were buried without identification. They lacked names on monuments, farewell ceremonies, and any recognition. They were replaceable, functional, and temporary. The use of miners as a war resource by the Vietcong was neither marginal nor circumstantial. It was an integral part of a strategy that conceived childhood not as a protected stage, but as moldable and sacrificable material. The creation of an armed generation from childhood responded to a structured project that subordinated the lives of the youngest to the logic of revolutionary war. The Vietcong carried out a radical transformation of the Vietnamese environment, turning jungles, fields, and paths into a lethal network where every natural element could become an instrument of destruction. This strategy went beyond military sabotage and became total psychological warfare, where even walking involved the constant risk of mutilation or death. The poisoned spike traps were the most widespread example of this philosophy. Bamboo stakes, cut at an angle and hardened by fire, were arranged in pits concealed with vegetation. To increase their effectiveness, they were coated with contaminating substances, excrement, decomposing blood, plant extracts, or stolen chemicals. This way, even superficial wounds became lethal infections. The primary purpose was not immediate death, but to incapacitate the soldier, forcing costly evacuations and conveying a message of collective terror. A combatant wounded in the foot by a poisoned stake became a silent warning for his entire unit. These traps were placed in strategic points such as bottlenecks, water sources, and evacuation routes. Some were left visible on purpose to induce anxiety, while others remained hidden to maintain the element of surprise. Reports from 1968 indicated that in certain American units around 1/10 of the casualties were caused by punji-style traps, not by direct enemy fire. Improvised mines represented another common resource. Made from unexploded ordnance or recycled materials, they were camouflaged in cans, toys, agricultural tools, or even animal carcasses. One of the most common variants consisted of hiding a grenade without a pin in a container connected to a wire. When activated, the explosion occurred at torso height, maximizing damage. In Quang Tri province, a battalion of Marines lost more than 20 men in one single day due to a chain of traps linked along several kilometers, demonstrating the technical sophistication and coordination capability of the insurgency. Unlike conventional armies, the Vietcong prioritized incapacitating wounds over direct elimination. An injured soldier needed to be transported by several comrades, evacuated by helicopter, receive specialized medical treatment, and remain out of combat for several months. With this logic, many traps were designed to mutilate limbs, pierce the abdomen without immediately damaging vital organs, or cause permanent injuries that would mark the survivor for their entire life. Some structures included spring mechanisms that launched projectiles towards the face or eyes, causing blindness and disfigurement. The constant threat of this type of injury generated a lasting paranoia among the soldiers, who knew that any movement could result in irreparable damage, including the loss of reproductive functions. A guerrilla warfare manual captured in 1967 contained detailed instructions for dozens of traps classified according to the terrain, the type of target, and the nature of the injury sought. It included sections on the psychology of fear, construction of homemade explosives, and camouflage techniques that turned the landscape into an invisible minefield. The testimonies of wounded soldiers illustrate the effects of this system. An American combatant, hit in 1969, recounted how his leg was pierced by a stake smeared with excrement and plant poison amid absolute silence. A military doctor described in 1970 the explosion of a mine camouflaged in a fake melon, which left a soldier without a recognizable face. In both cases, the psychological impact of facing an invisible enemy proved to be as devastating as the physical wound. The Vietcong did not limit their use of the landscape to traps and explosives. They also employed civilians as active components of their arsenal. In villages under insurgent control, children, women, and the elderly were forced to stand in front of defensive positions to act as human shields. This tactic exploited the restraint of the American and South Vietnamese forces, trained to avoid civilian casualties. In ambushes, unarmed peasants were pushed towards enemy lines, while snipers fired from hidden positions. In certain operations, entire populations were chained and forced to walk in front of armored vehicles, anticipating possible ambushes. Those who tried to escape were executed on the spot as a warning. Another practice consisted of using villagers as human mine detectors. They were forced to march in a line through suspicious paths to clear the area. These actions not only reduced the risk for the combatants, but also instilled terror in neighboring communities, who understood that they could be used in the same way at any time. The planned confrontations became theatrical representations of terror. An initial explosion served as the signal for the start of the attack, followed by simultaneous volleys from prepared positions. Soldiers seeking cover activated new traps concealed in bushes, logs, or rocks. Within a few seconds, an organized patrol could become a chaotic group of wounded, unable to respond to enemy fire. The impossibility of counterattacking an invisible adversary generated a feeling of helplessness that eroded morale beyond what a conventional defeat could achieve. The psychological effects of this system were long-lasting. Many soldiers developed a permanent distrust of the terrain, a pathological fear of advancing, and a loss of cohesion that could only be resolved with long periods of rest or the complete relief of units. The Vietcong thus demonstrated that a force inferior in weaponry could neutralize technological advantages by manipulating the environment and a willingness to sacrifice both combatants and civilians. The conversion of the landscape into an ecosystem of death constituted a far-reaching tactical innovation. Subsequently, insurgent movements in other regions adopted similar methods: camouflage traps, use of human shields, and forced use of civilians as tactical resources. The Vietnamese experience showed that the terrain, transformed with creativity and calculated cruelty, could become as powerful a weapon as any modern arsenal. After the reunification of Vietnam in 1975, the Vietcong achieved not only military victory, but also the strategic dominance of historical memory. While there is an abundance of international testimonies and archives documenting their methods, within the country the National Liberation Front was enshrined as an immaculate symbol of heroic resistance. The Communist Party built a hegemonic narrative that glorifies the Vietcong as the embodiment of the heroic peasantry and a liberating force against imperialism. The official mythology presents its guerrillas as fighters of absolute moral purity, whose methods would always have been justified by the anti-colonial cause. In the museums of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, the exhibitions show only idealized scenes: guerrillas assisting villagers, distributing food, or teaching to read. There is no reference to purges, executions, child recruitment, mass graves in Hue, or clandestine prisons. The representation of the insurgency is limited to a heroic iconography that hides any aspect of coercion, political violence, or internal repression. The educational system reproduces this vision. The textbooks present the Vietcong as a central component of national liberation without questioning. The texts maintain that their actions were necessary and morally superior, while the South Vietnamese victims are described as collaborators or simply erased from the narrative. Teachers interviewed in private have acknowledged receiving explicit instructions to avoid critical debates. To uncomfortable questions, it is responded that these are rumors, enemy propaganda, or inventions of reactionary elements. The control of information is ensured through press and internet censorship. Journalistic investigations into controversial episodes have been blocked, and those who insisted faced loss of licenses or forced exile. Critical academics have seen their projects cancelled, access to archives denied, and in some cases dismissed under accusations of anti-state activities. On the web, searches for sensitive terms like Hue Massacre or child soldiers in Vietnam are filtered, eliminating critical results. Users who share testimonies of victims receive warnings or are subjected to police investigation. The War Remnants Museum clearly illustrates this selective narrative. Its rooms document in detail American atrocities such as the My Lai massacre, the use of napalm or Agent Orange. Tortures committed in South Vietnamese prisons are also exhibited. However, there is not a single reference to Vietcong victims, mass executions, or the use of minors in combat. This unilateral presentation generates a narrative in which only one side committed crimes, while the other is portrayed with absolute legitimacy. After the communist victory, hundreds of thousands of civilians, officials, and military personnel associated with the previous regime were subjected to persecution. About 200,000 people were sent to re-education camps where they remained from a few months to several decades under extreme deprivations and intensive indoctrination programs. These facilities sought to disintegrate previous identities and rebuild the political loyalty of the prisoners. Others chose exile. Tens of thousands set out to sea in precarious vessels, a phenomenon known as boat people. They faced storms, piracy, and hunger, with mortality rates of up to 1/2 on some routes. For them, fleeing was preferable to remaining under a system that reduced them to silence. Those who stayed learned to keep quiet. Speaking about executions, torture, or murdered relatives meant exposing themselves to surveillance, job loss, or imprisonment. The families of victims preserved memories only in private spaces, transmitting stories in whispers and hiding them from the public sphere. This created a cultural fracture, an official celebratory memory and an intimate memory marked by fear. This duality produced a society where lived experience and public history remained disconnected. In exile, especially in the United States, Australia, France, and Canada, Vietnamese communities established alternative institutions, community museums, oral archives, and documentation centers that collected survivors' testimonies. Organizations like Boat People SOS or Vietnamese American Heritage Foundation were dedicated to recording documents, interviewing victims, and preserving a memory excluded in the country of origin. However, this diaspora memory remains isolated from the official Vietnamese discourse. The disparity in the treatment of massacres reveals the political selectivity of historical justice. The My Lai case has been widely investigated, documented in books and documentaries with public trials, monuments, and official apologies. It became a global reference for American war crimes. In contrast, Hue is still denied by the Vietnamese state. There are no monuments, academic investigations were banned, families silenced, and the topic excluded from public education. The United States, as a democratic society with independent media, could not permanently hide My Lai. Vietnam, as an authoritarian regime with complete control of media and institutions, has kept silent about Hue for almost half a century. Since the 1990s, declassified files from the CIA, the Department of State, and international organizations have documented purges, blacklists, clandestine prisons, and forced recruitment. Testimonies from former combatants have also emerged, such as the one published in 2007 by Asia Times, where a former commander acknowledged that the guerrillas were trained to eliminate without hesitation, considering those who did not unconditionally follow the movement as enemies. Despite the existence of this documentation, its distribution within Vietnam remains prohibited. Disseminating it is considered a subversive activity punishable by decades of imprisonment. Meanwhile, in diaspora cities like Westminster, Melbourne, Paris, or Montreal, altars, cultural centres, and historical archives were erected to keep alive the memory of victims ignored by the Vietnamese state. The silence surrounding the Vietcong methods constitutes a deliberate project by the regime to erase uncomfortable episodes and consolidate a nationalist myth. In Vietnam, this project has succeeded, with entire generations educated without knowledge of purges, child soldiers, massacres, or clandestine prisons. The truth, however, persists beyond state boundaries. It resides in the archives of international organizations, in testimonies preserved in democratic countries, and in the voice of exiles who refuse to let memory disappear under official propaganda. The Vietcong was not only a heroic peasant force that fought for independence, it was also an apparatus of ideological repression, indoctrination, and political terror that contributed to the consolidation of the authoritarian state after 1975. The full history requires including that dark side so far relegated, which remains waiting for recognition.